Hello, everyone. Today I want to tell you the story of a young man named Ryan, who was trapped in a cycle of bad habits. Like many of us, Ryan had a few habits he wasn't proud of. He wanted to change them, but he didn't know where to start. He knew these habits were holding him back, but no matter how hard he tried, he kept slipping back into the same old patterns. Sound familiar? This is the story of how Ryan learned to break his bad habits one step at a time and how you can do the same. Ryan's day always started the same way. He'd hit the snooze button a couple of times, then rush through his morning routine, grab some fast food for breakfast, and scroll through social media while trying to wake up. He knew this wasn't good for him, but somehow it had become his routine. One day he met an old friend, James, who looked healthier and happier than Ryan had ever seen him before. Ryan asked him, "What's your secret? You look like you've got your life together." James smiled and said, "I didn't change my life overnight, but I did start by changing my habits." Do you know why we keep bad habits? They make us feel good in the short term, even if they're bad for us in the long run. Breaking them isn't just about willpower, it's about understanding why we're doing them in the first place. James explained that bad habits often develop as a way of coping with stress, boredom, or discomfort. Ryan realized that his habit of scrolling through social media was a way to avoid starting his day and facing whatever stress came with it. Once he understood this, he knew he could do something about it. James told Ryan, "Most people fail to change their habits because they try to change too much at once. The secret is to start small and be patient. Don't expect results overnight. You didn't form these habits in a day, and you won't break them in a day either." Ryan decided to focus on one habit at a time. He chose the easiest one to tackle first, his snooze button addiction. Instead of trying to wake up an hour earlier, he set a goal to only hit snooze once. It seemed simple, but that's exactly what he needed, something so small that it didn't feel overwhelming. For the first few days, he still felt the urge to hit snooze multiple times, but he remembered James's advice: be patient with yourself. Slowly it became easier. After a week, he found that he didn't need to hit snooze at all. After seeing some progress with his morning routine, Ryan asked James, "What do I do about my other bad habits? It feels like if I stop doing them, I'll just have this big empty space in my day." James nodded. "That's exactly what happens if you just stop a bad habit without replacing it. Nature hates a vacuum, right? If you remove a habit, you have to fill that space with something better." Ryan's next goal was to stop scrolling through social media first thing in the morning. He decided to replace it with reading a few pages of a book instead. He wasn't aiming to read a whole chapter or even a long article, just a few pages to get his brain going. At first it felt strange. His hand would instinctively reach for his phone, but he caught himself, picked up his book, and read instead. After a few days, he noticed something interesting. He felt less rushed and more focused in the mornings. Ryan felt like he was making real progress, but he still struggled with some habits, especially when he was stressed. One evening, after a particularly tough day at work, he found himself back on social media, mindlessly scrolling. The next day, he met James again and told him about his setback. James said, "Don't be too hard on yourself. It's normal to slip up, but now you need to figure out what triggered that habit." Bad habits are often triggered by certain feelings, environments, or situations. Ryan thought about it and realized that his social media habit was triggered by stress. Whenever he felt overwhelmed, he'd turn to his phone for distraction. James suggested finding a healthier way to deal with that stress. Instead of reaching for his phone, Ryan decided to go for a short walk after work whenever he felt stressed. The next time he felt overwhelmed, he took a 10-minute walk around his neighborhood. It wasn't a huge commitment, but it helped him clear his mind and relax without falling back into his old habits. As Ryan started to make progress, he found that some days were easier than others. On tough days, he was tempted to fall back into his old ways. One evening, he almost skipped his walk and spent an hour on his phone, feeling guilty afterward. That's when James told him, "You don't have to do this alone. It's easier to stick to your goals when you have someone to keep you accountable." James suggested Ryan find an accountability partner, someone he could check in with about his progress. Ryan asked his co-worker Sarah, who was also trying to break some bad habits, if they could support each other. They agreed to check in every day, either by text or in person, about how they were doing with their goals. Having Sarah as an accountability partner made a big difference. On days when Ryan didn't feel like sticking to his new habits, he thought about having to tell Sarah that he'd slipped up, and that gave him the push he needed to stay on track. Even with all the progress Ryan was making, he still had days where he slipped back into old habits. One particularly stressful week at work, he found himself hitting snooze again, skipping his morning walk, and spending hours on social media in the evening. He felt like he had failed. When he talked to James about it, James said, "Setbacks are part of the process. The important thing is not to give up. Forgive yourself for those bad days and get back on track the next day." Ryan realized that expecting perfection wasn't realistic. He was human, and humans make mistakes. What mattered was that he kept going even when he stumbled. He started to see setbacks not as failures, but as learning opportunities. As Ryan continued his journey, James gave him one final piece of advice: don't wait until you've completely broken a habit to celebrate. Celebrate the small wins along the way. It'll keep you motivated. Ryan started noticing all the small wins he'd achieved. He was waking up without hitting snooze. He was spending less time on social media. He felt more relaxed and less stressed. These were all victories, even if he hadn't fully broken every bad habit yet. Every week, he'd take a moment to acknowledge the progress he'd made. He treated himself to something small, a nice meal, a movie night, or even just some extra downtime. These small celebrations kept him motivated to keep going. Breaking bad habits isn't a one-time thing, it's about creating a new lifestyle. Ryan learned that consistency was key. The more he stuck with his new habits, the easier they became. Over time, his bad habits started to fade, and his new habits took their place. He didn't wake up one day completely transformed, but little by little, he became the person he wanted to be. It wasn't always easy, and there were still days when he struggled, but Ryan had learned how to manage those challenges. He understood his triggers, had healthier coping mechanisms, and knew that setbacks didn't mean failure. One of the most important things Ryan realized on his journey was that everyone's path is different. What worked for James might not work exactly the same for him, and that was okay. The key was finding what fit into his life and sticking with it. Ryan developed a morning routine that worked for him. He'd wake up without hitting snooze, read a few pages of a book, and go for a short walk before starting his day. He found that this routine made him feel calm and focused, setting the tone for a productive day. He also built a wind-down routine for the evenings. Instead of scrolling through social media before bed, he'd spend time journaling or listening to calming music. This helped him sleep better and wake up feeling refreshed. Finally, Ryan learned the most important lesson of all: be kind to yourself. Breaking bad habits is hard work, and it takes time. There will be days when you mess up, and that's okay. The key is to keep going, even when it feels tough. Ryan realized that self-compassion was just as important as discipline. By being kind to himself, forgiving his mistakes, and celebrating his progress, he found the strength to keep moving forward. So, what can we learn from Ryan's story? Breaking bad habits isn't about being perfect. It's about understanding why you have those habits, taking small steps to change them, and being patient with yourself along the way. Replace bad habits with good ones, recognize your triggers, and find support when you need it. Most importantly, don't give up. Your journey to break bad habits might take time, but every small step you take brings you closer to becoming the person you want to be. And just like Ryan, with consistency, patience, and self-compassion, you'll get there.